Buenas tardes and welcome to this Centro event. As you know, we at Centro are spending the entire day focusing on a region of the country where Puerto Ricans have chosen to live in increasing numbers, but have not received the academic attention that the numbers of its population and its social importance have in describing the modern Puerto Rican experience in the United States. I am Carlos Vargas Ramos. I am a researcher at Centro, and today we are focusing on La Florida as part of this Centro event. And for this afternoon's program, we are honored to have with us the Honorable Maurice Ferre, the former mayor of the city of Miami. And this conversatorio is part of the Central Legacy series, by which we attempt to collect, retain, and disseminate the history of our community in the United States. Legacy seeks to collect the vivencias and the testimonios of active participants in the Puerto Rican communities in the United States, as well as leading figures, Puerto Rican figures. And there is no doubt in our mind that Maurice Ferre is such a leading figure. Even if his projection nationally has been limited by the often narrow focus on the Northeast and perhaps the Midwest that Puerto Rican studies or scholars on Puerto Rican studies have taken. The fact that Mayor Ferre was the first Puerto Rican mayor of a city in the United States, and an important one as that, as Miami is reason enough to motivate us to ask him to spend a few hours with us to share with us his experience in this country. But before we start asking the mayor about his past, let's begin with the present and ask our guest to tell us about his most recent effort. As you may know, Maurice Ferre was a candidate in the Democratic primary process for the U.S. Senate from the state of Florida. So, Mr. Mayor, first of all, welcome. And to begin, what motivated you to run for this position, the U.S. Senate, in 2010?
Well, first of all, Carlos, to you and to all of the members of El Centro that are here, my gratitude, especially to Dr. Patricia Silver, who has been working diligently in Central Florida on the issues that we're going to discuss. My last visit here was when Ferre was the director, and I had a very, very interesting day here touring and understanding the important work that the Centro does for the Puerto Rican community, not just in New York, but I think the Puerto Rican community throughout the United States, because I think the projection in the future of this is really national in scope. So thank you for having me. When I made the decision to run, I was 74 years old. And, but I'm a very young 74. My uncle Luis Ferre died 3 months short of 100. My own father, Jose Ferre Joe, died at age 89. Sister Isolina died at age 85. So I come from a family both on the Ferre and Aguayo side of longevity. So I figured that I'm a young 74. So I decided that I had a lot of public policy and political experience, and that my career was not over and that I should really share this. I thought that I could win on position papers, and that I thought that I could put out some very, very strong policy papers, which I did, and that would make such a distinction between me and my opponents that I would get the Democratic Party establishment to recognize the political importance of the Latino vote in Florida, and that that would then that my aspirations and my candidacy would catch on fire, and I would get the money to then conclude the race. That didn't happen. It didn't happen for many, many reasons. I started late. the Democratic Party establishment had already made a decision to back Congressman Kendrick Meek. But let me use this as a juxtaposition to explain the importance of the Hispanic Latino vote in Florida and why I thought that the Democratic Party establishment would recognize the significance of this opportunity. Our current president, Barack Obama, carried the state of Florida in November of 2008 by 236,000 votes. That was in an election of 8,300,000 votes. Out of 11.5 million registered voters, 8,000,003 voted, which was a record, almost a record for Florida at 73-74%. The interesting thing is that a study done by Sergio Ben-Dixon, who is a well-recognized pollster, showed that the swing vote from 2004 to 2008 of the Latino Hispanic vote was 317,000 votes. Now, the additional black turnout vote was 205,000. So that between the black and the Latino vote, there was over 500,000 swing votes. The total swing vote, Democratic to Republican, from 2004 to 2008 was 610,000. Now, what that means is that obviously without the Latino Hispanic vote, Barack Obama would not have been elected in the state of Florida. I think that truism is patent and will be patent in the election this November. In other words, without the Hispanic vote, a Democrat cannot duplicate what Barack Obama did in 2008. Now, what that means is that I thought that the opportunity to have a Democrat as a United States Senator was through a Latino, and the only Latino running in the Democratic Party was me. So that I thought that that was a self-evident truth that would influence the party leaders to recognize that Kendrick Meek, who is African American, will not get the black vote out. He didn't in August in the primary, and he won't in November, in sufficient numbers to win that. And I think my prediction is coming true, even though I think that the current governor, Charlie Crist, is going down and Kendrick Meek is going up. And he's gone up from an 18% now to 24%. But in a three-person race, which is what this is, you need to have at least 33% to win. And Kendrick Meek cannot reach 33%, the congressman. So therefore, I think that seat is going to go to Marco Rubio, who is a Cuban-American, extreme right-wing Tea Party movement. But interestingly enough, he will be the third Cuban-American who will have been elected to the United States Senate in the last 10 years. So, and I put that into juxtaposition because before Mel Martinez, former mayor of Orlando, of Orange County in Central Florida, the two previous Hispanics that were elected to the United States Senate in the history of the United States were Ken Salazar, who is Hispanic American from southern Colorado. As you know, that part of southern Colorado and northern New Mexico is all Hispanic, but Hispanic of 400 years. And before that, it was Senator Dennis Chavez, who was from New Mexico and who married a Puerto Rican de apellido Tristani, ponceño por supuesto. And as a matter of fact, Gloria Tristani, the granddaughter of Senator Chavez, ran for governor of New Mexico, and she, of course, is a Puerto Rican New Mexican. But two Hispanics, senators, and now there'll be 3 Cuban Americans. In 112 years that we Puerto Ricans have been part of the United States, there has never been a Puerto Rican elected to the U.S. Senate. So I thought that we would get a Sonia Sotomayor opportunity, which did not happen.
And you mentioned that you ran on public policy, on your policy positions.
Yes.
And your website shows a slew of different policy positions.
Which I wrote myself.
Right. Even more commendable in this day and age of political campaigning. You obviously are bringing to the table this long experience. You have had a long career in public service and in politics in the state of Florida, serving as a state legislator, as a Miami City Commissioner, and both of these happened in the mid to late 1960s, and then serving as mayor of the city of Miami for 12 years, beginning in 1973. You became an elected official when you were in your mid-30s.
Yes.
What motivated you then to run at that time?
Yeah.
Now you have the political experience.
Yeah.
Then you didn't. What motivated you at that time to run?
Well, like all Puerto Ricans, I have always had this issue with identity. Mm-hmm. Okay, and I of course had no doubts that I'm Puerto Rican. That's not the problem. The problem is the definition of what is a Puerto Rican, and the definition of what is an American, and can they coexist? Since we'll be talking about this throughout the half hour that we'll be discussing this, let me just come out with my thesis, which I have now changed in my older age, and I'll tell you about that in the end. But I've always had this idea, this question about culture, because what we're really talking about in identity is culture. So I'm not a cultural anthropologist, Patricia, but I think that cultural anthropology is really where the answers are. In other words, I think those are the issues that really have to be understood. And I think that culture is a very complicated, multifaceted, three-dimensional thing that is continually changing and evolving. Because as human beings, we're always changing, and it all depends on circumstances and where we are and who and how we deal with things. So our cultural identity changes as we evolve in life. And the example that I always like to give is in the question of loyalties. I love my mother, I love my wife, I love my daughter, and I love my granddaughters. The fact that I love one doesn't exclude me from loving the others, because we are multifaceted as human beings. And I think loyalties are the same thing. The fact that I am a Catholic doesn't deny me the right to see things in another dimension, in other circumstances. For example, I'm a Catholic, and yet I believe in free choice. See, now, so we change because we're influenced by the milieu that we live in. Okay, so now to your question. The question is, how did I get interested in politics in the beginning? Well, because when I was in my 20s and as a teenager, I identified myself first as a Puerto Rican and then as an American. Okay? And to me, the Puerto Ricanness of that was through two people in my family. One was my aunt and my godmother, Sister Isolina, who was a socialist, almost a communist, and independentista, pero hasta más no poder. She was a very strong pro-independence person. My uncle was Luis Ferre, who was, in those days, the vice president of the Republican Party, the statehood party of Puerto Rico. And every 4 years, he was the candidate for his party for governor, and he lost, of course. He ran and lost and ran and lost and ran. He was like Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln ran 7 times before he became president, and he only won 1 of those 7 times. Well, my uncle was the Abraham Lincoln of Puerto Rico. He'd run and he'd lose, and he'd run and he'd lose. And I used to go as a teenager and as a young man every 4 years to go help him in his campaigns. And I'd spend a month or 2, even though I was studying in New Jersey in a prep school here, and then I went to the University of Miami. I would go to Puerto Rico, and so these things have a way of catching on, and so I took an interest in public policy and in especially the issues of Puerto Rico. And the question for me was, do I go back to Puerto Rico or do I stay in Florida? And so I wasn't quite sure yet in the 60s. And so I ran, so I said, let me try this out. And I ran and won and became a state legislator. Here you call them assemblymen, but in Florida they're called legislators. So I became a state representative for a district which was not at all Hispanic. And so then, when the mayor of Miami, who had run for governor, died, there was an opening in the City of Miami Commission, and I accepted a temporary appointment, ran for that office, won it, and then in 1973, there was another circumstance that made it an opening, and I ran for mayor, and I won that election. That was in the year 1973. The Puerto Rican community of Miami, there was an identity of an area called Wynwood. I don't know, do you want me to get into this discussion?
Yeah, if you please.
Okay. There were 2 Puerto Rican communities, and I think this goes apropos, Patricia, to this distinction. Because I think if you look at Puerto Rican communities, whether they are in Connecticut or New Jersey or New York, or in Central Florida or Miami, you have to make several distinctions. First of all, there is a distinction of culture, race, ethnicity, class. These are all things that go into the very complicated process of who we are, And so there were 2 Puerto Rican communities in South Florida. Interestingly enough, one was a result of the 1940 election in Puerto Rico. When Muñoz wins in 1940, the sugar aristocracy and the people of the upper echelons of the sugar industry, which dominated Puerto Rico at that time, decided that Puerto Rico was going to go communist and socialist, and Muñoz was nothing but a communist, and it was the end of Puerto Rico. And so there was a mass migration of those people. I'm talking about Don Juan Serrayes, his nephew, P. Juan Serrayes, the Roig family. There was a tremendous exodus of the wealthy classes of Puerto Rico, so that when I first get to Miami in the 1950s, there was a tremendous presence of wealthy, mostly white, educated Puerto Ricans. Pan American Bank of Miami was part of that. Paquito Bianchi from Mayagüez had the Bianchi Insurance Company. Mercy Hospital was full of Puerto Rican doctors. So the real Puerto Rican, the real Latino Hispanic community was upper crust Puerto Ricans in Miami. Now, separate from that, there was the migrant community who first came up to Michigan. They were organized, and forgive me, my history is off, but it was post-war. It was in the early 1940s. 45, 46, maybe 47, 48. And those people then, instead of going back to Puerto Rico when the apple season was over, started becoming migratory agricultural workers. And of course, the agricultural world was in South Florida, because in those days, when you had green beans and tomatoes and other things, they didn't come from Mexico, they came from South Florida. So there was a major movement of Puerto Ricans that came as agricultural workers in the 40s. And those people slowly said, well, we're not going to leave. So where they concentrated was in Wynwood. Okay? And Wynwood was a small little community in central Miami. And there was a bridge close to Wynwood that crossed over to Miami Beach. And most of those people worked in the hotels in Miami Beach. So there was a tremendous presence of Puerto Ricans. So when I ran for public office, there was a Puerto Rican community that was mostly based in Wynwood. It was very interesting, but they did not elect me.
So who elected you?
Okay, this is an interesting story, because I think this will then distinguish me from what happened in the Puerto Rican political world in New York. Here's the way I describe it. Politics is like riding a surfboard, okay? Now, for those of you that are not surfers, when you go out and you wait for a wave and you ride it in, where you get up on the board depends, in other words, the difference between wiped out, which is falling off the board, and making it to the end, is where you distribute your weight on the board. So as the wave changes, you have to change where you stand on the board. That's the point. So here's my story. In 1973, when I'm elected mayor of Miami, 3% of the vote was Hispanic. So obviously I was not elected either as a Latino and much less as a Puerto Rican. I was just a young guy that had served in the legislature, a graduate of the University of Miami, and I projected myself as just another American running for public office. And that's what I did. And I became mayor of Miami. In Miami in those days, elections were every 2 years. So I was constantly running for public office. In 1979, in a 5-member commission, one of my colleagues was a woman by the name of Rose Gordon. Wonderful woman, intelligent, good liberal Democrat, from New York, Jewish, dedicated, hardworking. She said, you know, the Cubans have now come into Miami, and sooner or later they're going to take over. And this is my last opportunity for a non-Hispanic to be mayor of Miami. So she ran against me, 1979. So I had a tough race, because she was very talented. She carried the white vote, which had been my vote previously. She split the black vote with me, 50-50. I won because by 1979, 30% of the vote was Hispanic, mostly Cuban. So, you know, I Cubanized, and and I shifted my weight on the board, and I won. 2 years later, I said 79, right? 2 years later, in 1981, my other colleague, who was the first Cuban American ever elected to any position in Florida, Manolo Rebozo, said, it's time for the Cubans to take over Miami. So I said, well, Manolo, you and I are colleagues and friends. He said, no, you served long enough. You've been here now since 73. It's been now 8 years. 8 years is long enough. So he ran for mayor. Now all of a sudden, my Cuban base, which I had worked hard and won, was gone. And so the question was, is the white Anglo vote sufficiently large to win? And the answer then was no. So the only way I could maintain myself as mayor was to get the black vote. Well, in the election of 1981, we broke a record. Here's the record. Black vote, 64% turnout. Highest in a non-presidential election in the history of Miami, before or after. That's never been duplicated. I got a 64% black turnout in 1981. And I got 95% of that vote. And so I did the impossible. In other words, Manuel Rebozo was absolutely certain that by this time, the Cuban vote was now close to 50%. And but what he didn't understand is that I would always get a certain amount of Cubans. So I got 24% of the Hispanic vote. Now, which means that he got the difference. He got 76% of the Latino vote, which had been my vote, my base vote, was gone. I got 24%. But 24% with 95% of the black vote with a high black turnout, and I carried the white vote 60%.
So what were the appeals you were making to these different constituents? First when you were elected in '73, then when you faced the challenge by Gordon, and finally when you faced the challenge by Warrior.
I think
you were shifting off that circle.
Yeah, the unfortunate part of American politics is not only that politics is local, as Tip O'Neill well said, but it's also ethnic. So it was, unfortunately, my 1979 appeal was ethnic. In other words, I'm Hispanic, you're Cuban, we're not the same, but we're close, vote for me. And the Hispanic vote, the Latino vote, voted for me because I am Puerto Rican, okay? And that's close enough in 1979. But in 1981 with a Cuban, that's not close enough, see? So in other words, Cubano Vota Cubano began in Miami in 1981. And Cubano Vota Cubano really became a major theme in Miami politics, and it started in 1981 with me. Now the black vote is a little bit different. The black vote, and there I think I made a mistake, which I did not initiate. I was really a victim of it. But what happened is that this ethnicity, this ethnic appeal got out of hand. And of course, the thing that I dedicated, I would say, more than half of my campaign funds to the black vote. There were three major black stations. I bought those stations. They belonged to me. In other words, I bought out all the time. I brought down there was a fellow then by the name of Les Brown who became an inspirational speaker. He's a famous man. And then in those days he was married to Gladys and the Pips, I forget, Gladys Knight. Gladys Knight. Yeah. Les Brown was married to Gladys Knight. So Les Brown came down and I put the campaign in his hands. And of course he got Martin Luther King out of the grave, and We Shall Overcome, and I became the first black mayor of Miami in the same way that Bill Clinton became the first black president. In other words, you don't have to be black to be black, okay? And you don't have to be. So I became a figure that now. This wasn't casual. I mean, I had appointed the first black police chief. I had appointed the first black police, the first black city attorney. I had appointed, in other words, I had broken major ground in Miami. And I had, as mayor of Miami, when I became mayor in 1973, Miami was a southern racist town. Okay? I mean, racist town. And I got the city attorney, and I said, we're going to Washington to the Justice Department. We have an appointment with the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. He said, well, what's this about? I said, well, you'll find out when you get to Washington. So we went to Washington, we sit down, and the Deputy Justice said, well, what can I do for you, Mr. Mayor? I said, well, sir, I'm here to tell you that the city of Miami has a racist police department, and the Justice Department must intervene. And I can't control it. And it's exclusionary, and here's the record, and here's the proof of it, and here's what's happened. Now, out of that came a 4-year battle, which I wasn't able to really completely control, but we ended up with a consent decree. And the consent decree, in effect, opened up the City of Miami Police Department for some very radical changes, amongst which I appointed the first black police chief, which was a scandal, in Florida. But it was an accomplishment. So in 1981, I didn't come into the African American community without credentials. So it was a believable transition. So in effect, I earned that vote. However, you don't get a 64% turnout and a 95% vote for a non-black unless there's cause. And the cause was, well, I'll tell it to you this way. My opponent was Manolo Rebozo in 1981, Cuban American, Democrat. He flew up to the Reagan White House, and Ronald Reagan, as president, had an interview with him. He did not become a Republican, and he didn't get Reagan's endorsement, but he took a picture. And he took a picture of him sitting at the White House and shaking hands. Came back to Miami, and that night they made posters and they plastered it all over Little Havana. Well, I got a copy of that poster that same night, and I had 10,000 copies made, and I put them in every post in Overtown and in Liberty City, which is the black part of Miami. There was a picture of Rebozo with Ronald Reagan. So hey.
You're telling us that you know how to play politics.
Cubano Vota Cubano has a counterpart, and that was Cuban takeover, which was basically a black message, subliminal. That wasn't so subliminal. A direct message of the antagonism that occurred. And I was a participant in that, which I regret. But that was the only way I could win. And unfortunately, politics in this American democracy, those things happen.
And those tensions and those frictions certainly boiled over precisely in Overtown and in Liberty City.
Yeah, well, that was in 1981. That was that same year. So in other words, things were raw. You remember, in 1981, four things happened in Miami, which were significant. One was Mariel, that was the boat lift, okay, in 1980. Two were the Liberty City riots, okay. Three were cocaine cowboys, which took over Miami, and four was the front page of, the cover of Time magazine, Miami, Paradise Lost. So all those things happened at the same time. And so, yes, the circumstances were ripe for something like that to happen, and that's what happened.
And it is interesting because in the story so far, you are telling us that you were precisely at that inflection point where Miami stopped being a backward southern town to become a major metropolitan center with an international projection.
Yeah. Let me tell you a story about which I think captures, because I think stories simplify things because you can focus in a story on what happened. Dresdner Bank, one of the major German banks, decided that they were going to consolidate their Latin American operations in Miami. Now, I had spent since 1973, and actually before that on, trying to convince, I was very much involved in getting Dow Chemical to recognize that they could control their Latin American operations, which were very big and very important, from Miami better than from Midland, Michigan. So I was very much involved in the move of Dow Chemical from Midland, Michigan to Miami, to Coral Gables. It ended up in Coral Gables, but which is a sister city next to Miami. But after that, we were really able to get about 25 or 30 major international and American corporations to put their Latin American headquarters in Miami. So that was a big, big part of what I dedicated my time to. Now, here's what happened. Dresner was one of those. So Dresner comes down, and the chairman of the board, the CEO of Dresner, calls me from Hamburg, and he said, Mr. Mayor, I'm going to be in Miami. I want you, if you would honor me, if you would put together, we'll pay the cost, and you bring together all the leadership of Florida, if you can. And, you know, the Dresner Bank was next to Deutsche Bank in importance, and it was a major, major, major. And Dresner Bank had offices in Argentina, in Peru, in Mexico, and in Brazil since 1900, since before the First World War. So it was, you know, they're big guys. So Dresner's coming to Florida, major office, call to everyone to come to Miami. I had the top 20 CEOs of Florida, from Jacksonville, Orlando, Tampa, all over Florida. I had all the top political leadership. I had all the banks, all the bank presidents. So there must have been 50 people in the room. The man who co-hosted this with me that I had asked was Alva Chapman, who was the president CEO of Knight Ridder newspapers, who was then based in Miami. Miami Herald being one of their papers. Philadelphia Inquirer was another one, the Akron Journal, and the Detroit News. It was, you know, Knight Ridder was an important newspaper chain. They're based in Miami. So Alva Chapman, I welcome the Dresner people. Mr. Chapman gets up and he said, the center of the South has moved. Obviously, Mr. Chapman was from Georgia. He said, the center of the South has moved. It's moved from Atlanta to Miami. And Dresner's made a wise decision to open their offices in Miami. Chairman of Dresner gets up and he says, Mr. Mayor, thank you very much for the invitation. Mr. Chapman, thank you for your kind words, but I want to make sure you understand the situation. Dresner is in Miami, but we're not looking north, we're looking south. In other words, we're not here. I'm sure Florida, a lot of Florida business will develop from our presence in Miami. But we're here because we're consolidating our banks in Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia and Peru, where we have major offices here in Miami. This was a shock to all these people. Here it was in the mid-'70s or late '70s, and they didn't understand that the future of Miami was really looking south and not north. So yes, what occurred in the late 1970s and early 1980s were two major things happened in Miami. The most important by far was that the idea of think global, act local came into place. And that's exactly what we did in Miami. And to us, the importance of Miami geographically was not Japan and it wasn't Germany. If you look at a map, because people have a mistaken view, they think the west coast of Latin America is closest to the west coast of the United States, but it skews way over to the west. So if you go from Lima, Peru, the quickest way to get to the United States is through Miami. In other words, it's a straight north-south shot. Lima and Miami are in the same, at the same point in the globe. So if you're going to the United States, if you're going to California, if you're going to Los Angeles, from Lima, Peru, the quickest way to go is through Miami. You go Lima, Miami, Los Angeles. That's much quicker than if you were to fly from Lima to Los Angeles. Believe it or not. But look at the globe, and you can see it. You can't see it in a two-dimensional map. You have to look at it in the globe. So Miami really came into its own because it is the entry point to Latin America. So it isn't just the Caribbean. It's Buenos Aires. Miami now is in great movement because of the Brazilians now. I mean, fast forward now to 2010. What's exciting? What's happening in Miami that's exciting? The Brazilians. The Brazilians. Did they exist in Miami 10 years ago? Yeah, but not a major factor. So what's happened is that Miami really becomes like the funnel point. It's the entry point, and it has to do with geography. It has to do with the position of where Miami is. So I said two things. One was the internationalization, but that really means Latin Americanization of Miami. And the second thing that occurred, and I want to go back to the first because that really ties into all of this. The other thing was the urbanization of Miami. In other words, the concentration of power in a relatively short area. Today, for example, I'm involved in the Expressway Authority because I'm now worried about transportation and transit issues because I think we have to get away from automobiles and we have to move differently in the future, in the new America that we're going to, which is one of the reasons I ran for the Senate. But getting back to this transportation thing, you know, when I first said this in Miami, nobody believed it, but then when they looked at it, they realized the certainty of it. The main street in downtown Miami is called Flagler Street. It's a 0 point. You know, it's like Fifth Avenue is here. You know, on one side you have the east, and the other side you have the west. Okay, so that point is Flagler. It goes east-west. My statement is that if you go 10 miles north of Flagler Street and 10 miles south of Flagler Street, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Everglades, 85% of all the jobs in Miami are in that corridor. And that's exactly right. So in other words, the transportation issues, you know, if you juxtapose that into how you develop Miami, it's an easier thing to do because like Manhattan, which is an island, Miami really is also an island. It's between two bodies of water, but the bodies of water are not an ocean. It's the Atlantic Ocean on one side and it's the Everglades, but that's water too, right. See? And so what you have is a long, thin island like Puerto Rico, but maybe 10 times larger because it goes all the way up to along the East Coast.
I certainly want to give our audience a chance to participate and ask questions and engage in this conversatorio. But before going to...
But we haven't gotten into the issues of Puerto Rico and well, identity.
I also, you know, you've actually preempted many of the questions. A city and county commissioner, as well as mayor of a large city in the United States. However, you have not been, as you pointed out, a Puerto Rican elected official in the sense of representing a Puerto Rican community or being elected by a Puerto Rican electorate.
Yes.
Yet, your political trajectory represents a model that may be replicated by other candidates of Puerto Rican extraction. For instance, you have the example of Raul Labrador, who is an Idaho state legislator, who is running for Congress as a very conservative Republican candidate from that state, in a state that is only 10% Latino and less than 1% Puerto Rican. What does this model of political involvement mean, if anything, for Puerto Rican politics in the United States?
You've asked the key question, and that is the question. And here's why. Remember I told you that we had first Senator Dennis Chavez and then Ken Salazar. Mm-hmm. Those are the only two Hispanic senators. Then all of a sudden we have 3 Cubans. Mm-hmm. So the question is, how did those 3 Cubans get elected? Now, who are the 3 Cubans? The 3 Cubans are Mel Martinez is the first one, okay? The second one is Robert Menendez. And the third one I predict will be Marco Rubio a real right-wing Republican. I mean, Tea Party, Sarah Palin's favorite, okay? So you say, how's that possible? Well, it's the surfboard, stupid. It's the surfboard. Mel Martinez is a Democrat, okay? He gets elected as mayor of Orange County as a Democrat. Now, it's a nonpartisan race, as were my races as mayor of Miami. He's a nonpartisan, okay? Then Bush 2, W, takes him to Washington. He becomes a Republican, and then he goes up and becomes Secretary of Housing. Then he comes back and he runs for the U.S. Senate and beats an old, centrist, traditional Republican heavyweight, and beats him. Not by much. It was a very thin margin of victory, but he won. Okay? How did Bob Menendez win New Jersey? He couldn't win if he based his constituency on Hudson County. Because Hudson County is good, but it's not good enough to become a U.S. Senator from New Jersey. Because you've got northern New Jersey where there are no Cubans, or there are very few Cubans, or very few Latinos. So how do you win? Well, because you have to appeal to the general public. You have to move your weight on that surfboard to get the constituency that you need. That's exactly what Marco Rubio's doing. Marco Rubio's not a real right-wing nut. I mean, I know him well. And if you look at his history as a legislator, he was to the center, and in some things. So how does he become a guy who is for the Arizona immigration law, against Sonia Sotomayor, for English as the only language of the United States constitutionally, and all these right-wing positions? Well, you could call it hypocrisy, and there's no question that it is hypocrisy. But in the American constituency of American democracy, that's how you get elected. You get elected appealing to the general electorate, or to the people that make decisions in that state. So you say, well, does that mean that Puerto Ricans become Republicans in Central Florida? You answer that. Because there's a pattern of that happening. Why is 30% of the Puerto Rican community in Central Florida Republican? You say, well, that's not the same people that live in New York. No, it's not. Most of those people, by the way, are people from the island. They come up with the idea, because in Puerto Rico, there's very little difference between the way Colombians think of politics in Puerto Rico. In Colombia, you're born a conservador or a liberal, okay? And your grandfather and your great-grandfather were liberales. And you very seldom see a liberal vote conservative, and because it's a generational thing.